Gerard, you're in Switzerland, right?
Yes, yes, yes. In Lausanne.
In Lausanne.
Working from home, as every Swiss for the moment. One more week, we think, then we move out.
Oh,
Enjoy it as long as you can.
Exactly. Then back to the campus, yes. Are we all in the, is someone in a night time zone or early morning? Because
Yes.
here it's fine, it's
George-
5 p.m.
Georgios is approaching midnight in China.
Okay, thank you for staying up.
For me, it's only 8:30 at night. I'm in India.
Okay, okay,
It's still a reasonable hour.
okay.
Katan is in London.
Yeah,
Okay,
well, we are through the lockdown period for now. Just for
great.
now.
Yeah. It was already, yes.
Yeah, but I guess we all feel uncertain how soon we'll be back.
Mhm.
Basugi? Hello?
Yes, yes.
We are missing Miss Anya Kaspersen, correct?
Yes, she has not joined us yet.
I will forward you the phone number.
And I'll try reaching her. Okay. fine.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Let me call her directly. We're not in there yet. Yeah. Hello. Anya, are you with us? We are about to start. Fantastic. Great. Thank you. Right. Thank you.
She's joining. There she is. Hi, Anya.
Hi, good to see
Hello.
you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Hello, Anya. Nice to see you.
Hi, likewise.
Casper says that we see that you have joined through a phone. Can you switch it to the horizontal mode? Yes.
Is that better?
Yes. Thank you.
Are we ready, Vasuki?
Yes, sir. We'll play the video now.
Okay.
Welcome, friends of the World Academy and fellows. And this is WAAS Talks, a series of public debates by the World Academy of Art and Science on issues of contemporary interest. Today, we are debating the subject of science as a social good. For this subject that encompasses many interesting questions, contemporary questions on speed of scientific development and technologies advancements, we have a very impressive panel of speakers. I will just name them and actually introduce them as they are here. First, Gerhard Escher, who is the advisor to the board of the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, GESTA. Gerard currently is senior advisor to the president of the Swiss École Polytechnique Fédérale and has a diploma in biology from the University of Geneva and a PhD from the University of Lausanne. Previously, he worked at the Department of Neurobiology at Stanford University and as a postdoctoral fellowship and research associate at Stanford. We also have Anja Kaspersen, who is senior fellow at Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. Anja is a former director of the United Nations for Disarmament Affairs in Geneva and Deputy Secretary General on the Conference of Disarmament. Previously, she held the role as head of strategic engagement and new technology at International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC. And prior to joining the ICRC, she served as Senior Director for Geopolitics and International Security and was a member of the Executive Committee of the World Economic Forum. She is Norwegian, she's a Norwegian diplomat, business person, and academic. Welcome, Anja. And we also have Georgios Theodoropoulos, who is the chair professor of the Department of Computer Sciences and Engineering. This is the Academy of Shenzhen at the China's Silicon Valley. Professor Georgios Theodoropoulos is a computer scientist with a distinguished career in the industry, both in Europe and Asia. He is well known for his research and contribution in complex, intelligent, and data-intensive computer systems. We also have as fourth panelist, Ketan Patel. Hello, Ketan, co-founder and CEO of Greater Pacific Capital. Ketan has been an investor and strategist for over 30 years in this industry, in advisory, investment, banking, and investment at Greater Pacific Capital and Goldman Sachs and KPMG. He founded and leads the investment firm Greater Pacific Capital, which invests for nonprofit and impact. He was formerly the head of strategic group at Goldman Sachs. So welcome to all of you. We're also joined by the president of the World Academy, Gary Jacobs. That needs no further introductions. And let's go to the subject, as we said, science of today, science as social good. How can we adjust to the speed of scientific developments and technologies advancements? And these scientific advancements, are they for all of us, or the benefits are and discoveries of, let's say, biomedical technologies, for instance, are just for the elite of people, or should they be for the majority of the society? And how can people make informed choices? How public engagement can promote a genuine dialogue between the scientific community and the public? Is trust in the scientific discovery and in science declining, or on the contrary, is still holding its prestige? And how scientific advancement relates to individual values? What is right? What is wrong? So all these challenges and opportunities will be discussed by the panel and by the fellows of the World Academy that are with us right now. We have more than 40 participants at the time being. More will come. I ask kindly to all panelists to be succinct, to make a short presentation and interact with all of us. So let's start from Gerard, who is the presenter of the subject. And could you, Gerard, explain to us what does it mean to have science as a social good? And what is science for social good? Gerard, over to you.
Thank you. And it's a great pleasure to be here. So technological change is intense, rapid, and characterized today by the convergence of physical, digital, and biological worlds. This revolution has a very deep impact on human life because it might change not only society, but even human beings themselves. For instance, through genetic engineering or new human-machine interfaces. I will, from the point of view of research of science, address here science as a social good and science for social good. Science as a social good. I think we have a framework to make decisions concerning the development and use of these emerging powerful technologies, and it's the human rights framework. For me, I pick the heart of this framework. It's the human right to science. Article 15 of the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights from 1966, which stems from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 27, says, the states parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its application. I repeat, the states recognize the right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. This frame for me implies a series of important principles like transparency, accessibility, non-discrimination, inclusiveness, because of the word everyone is entitled, or accountability, benevolence, and respect for human dignity, because of the word benefit, not malefic, benefit, but also academic freedom and unboundedness of science, because of the word progress. And I think it suggests, this framework suggests that regulation should be designed to maximize the beneficial impact of scientific development and not just do risk governance. To miss opportunities to benefit from science is, in the human right frame to science, as serious as malevolence. And we could take the COVID-19 vaccines or non-access to those vaccines as an example. A second point is that if we think of the gap between science, scientific research, and society, scientists actually should anticipate the scientific and technology development and create processes and venues where we can discuss the probable breakthroughs in 5, 10, 25 years in important areas, quantum revolution, human augmentation, geoengineering, for instance. This discussion, is initiated by scientists who best know what is happening in the labs, but it has to occur together with all stakeholders, notably the diplomatic and multilateral world. And GESTA, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipators, wants to do that. The second point is science for social good. If we want science for social good, the science to push SDGs, the science who is advocate for a cause, then for scientists, I think a certain number of supplemental obligations are there. Of course, we must remain scientists. The scientific attitude, which is to trust in experiment and to be ready to change one's opinion if facts accumulate against your first opinion, this has to remain the scientific attitude. It's not one single method, it's an attitude. Science for social good requires strong interdisciplinarity, social sciences, natural sciences, and medicine together, and that is very difficult for our curricula at the universities. These projects for good must also be open in terms of data and in terms of publications, and we are accountable of what we put in there. We might also have to adapt the IP regime to move from confrontation to cooperation, from competition to cooperation. We have to show that we are independent from funders and that we are able to manage conflicts of interest. And as I said before, we have to anticipate and share this outcome with wider stakeholders. And we should be very aware and clear and ready to discuss dual use of these emerging technologies, which exist in every single technology. In the end, the last point, we have to be inclusive if we want to have science for social good. Today, a project for social good has to be conceived together with the intended beneficiaries. There is no top-down relationship from scientists and engineers to citizens or clients, but there is co-creation and partnering. Thank you. I hope I have not been too long.
Thank you, Gerhard. Thank you very much for your presentation, for delineating the guidelines, I would like to say, of how science is engaging for public good and how it should be also in this delicate time in human history, how science should come to help individuals and societies wherever they are. Let's hear from the second panelist, Anja Kaspersen, Senior Fellow at Carnegie Council for Ethics, International Affairs. The ethical dimension is particularly important, and you may have your own vision of where science stands. Anja?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. So my role today was actually to be a bit of a commentator to what Dr. Escher just spoke of. So I think I'll focus on that as opposed to doing my own sort of presentation. And he raised a couple of very interesting points that I'm sure we'll be hearing more from him on. So just a few things that I picked up from his initial presentation. And let me start with actually what he mentioned, because he mentioned, a lot of the convergences that we're seeing going on. And AI, for example, artificial intelligence, is one of these technologies which we also call feature technologies, allowing these convergences to take place at a scale and at a pace that we haven't seen before. So it's not, we are often discussing AI as a set aside or a single technology, as opposed to where it should be discussed, which is more of a feature technology underpinning many of these convergences that Dr. Escher was speaking of. And just to give you a very concrete example to kickstart my comments, what happens when we personalize these convergences? So he was referring to, at some point, he was speaking about genetic technologies and genetic sequencing. And we know now that there are fast developments happening in allowing us to essentially personalize and have wearables that allows us to read our genetic sequences real time. And who owns that proprietary data? And what happens to us as humans? And with how we, interpret, we often speak of humans to be our own cartographers of meaning, our own alchemists of meaning. But when we have algorithmic technologies essentially telling us real time what our body is craving, what we should be getting, what vitamins to get, what food to eat, where to go, and what is the responsibility that come from that, from society? Do we have the regulatory frameworks required to manage that? So that's one practical implications of these convergences that Dr. Escher was speaking of. And it's not a negative consequence, it's just one that we may not have fully embraced yet. And I think the acceleration coming out of the pandemic situation will definitely raise some of these issues. What happens when we tap into the most sacrosanct of data, which is the data about our biological selves? And what does that look like? That brings me to this issue around equality. And it was very interesting that Dr. Escher was referring to human rights, because of course, underpinning all of this is this notion of equality, which is the work that I'm doing with Carnegie Council, where we're looking at how these technologies could risk exacerbating or creating structural inequalities. The way that we play out and the way we deploy algorithmic technologies in particular, but also technologies at large. And one of the issues that has come up in those discussions where we're discussing equality has been this issue around trust, which you mentioned in your initial comments as well. And a lot of times these discussions ends up being discussions around trust in technology or trust in science. But what is less focused on is trust in decision makers and trust in decisions being taken around scientific priorities and technological applications. And that is something that is coming up more and more, as it should, that it's not just the technology or the scientific findings itself, but it's also the thought and the skills and the knowledge that goes into it as we are deciding where the priorities should be laying and what scientific discoveries it should be invested in. And again, you know, we had some major breakthroughs that are now allowing us to vaccinate at scale, you know, against a global pandemic situation. And of course, this raises a lot of these issues around trust in technology and trust in new technologies, and in these convergences that we talked about, which is very much at the root of why we've been able to advance in this area of vaccination. So again, back to Dr. Escher's points on these convergences, and especially in the biological field, and as the biological field relates to the to the machine learning advances that have happened in recent years. So maybe I'll leave it there at this point, and then we can come back to some of these issues, and we can go to the next speaker.
Yes, thank you very much, Anya. Very interesting points you raised, and others I'm sure will pick up from there. And in fact, the next one is Georgios Theodoropoulos. Georgios, you also listen from our presenter and from Anya. What is your perspective in the role of science for social good? I mean, are we there? Is this what is happening right now, or you envisage different measures to help global society to take full advantage of technological discoveries and advancements? Georgios, to you.
Thank you so much, Donato, and thank you so much for inviting me in this exciting panel. And it's a great honor to be amongst such distinguished panelists. So let me add my thoughts to the discussion, and allow me to start with a hypothesis that is what Gerard said at the beginning, that for science to be beneficial to society, it should be open, it should be inclusive, and I would add that it should be also big. And that means interdisciplinarity, so that it is able to tackle the complexity of the societal challenges in a holistic way. And it also means transparency and participation in terms of methodology, reproducibility of results, data collection, scientific communication, also involving the public. And that's something else that was raised, you know, the so-called citizen science. So the world is now in a unique position, actually, to pursue this type of scientific endeavor. We have the technologies. I mean, we have for the first time the computational power to do big science, you know, supercomputers. We have the data to develop serious AI systems that can tackle grand challenges. And we also have, you know, web-based technologies, cloud computing, big data, e-infrastructures that have already transformed the way research is done, and they enable the collaboration on a grand scale. And here I would like to mention, for example, the European Union, the infrastructures and the open science programs that provide unprecedented access to resources and collaboration opportunities. We also have frameworks and science policy trends. Again, I will mention the European the Horizon 2020 program in Europe, which is a good example of international collaboration, collaborative science, where social impact and integrated system thinking are basic requirements in most projects. And this goes beyond just interdisciplinary collaboration. So we also have very good examples where science and science diplomacy has been used to successfully initiate and manage large-scale international projects, and, you know, climate change, IPCC. I think these are obvious examples. However, we have challenges. Okay, we have challenges in terms of policy. For instance, which areas are relevant to invest in research, and what is the right balance between basic and applied research, for example. And in terms of science diplomacy, if you like, the COVID exposed important limitations and governance gaps. So in this case, scientific input seem to have been used to inform policy at the national level, you know, lockdowns and how you manage this kind of spreads. And at the same time, it appears to have fallen victim to geopolitical agendas that have created barriers. You know, we don't have universal guidelines. We have limited information exchange. fragmented research efforts, no mutual recognition of vaccines even. So we need mechanisms to address that, especially when facing such catastrophic issues. So we need global governance structures, as Gerald and Anya mentioned, and initiatives. Obviously, international organizations, initiatives such as GESNA, I think, are extremely important, and also academies have a key role to play in this, and for example, the initiative that WAAS has in this direction. We also need to ensure that scientists should be key stakeholders in national and international debates. And this raises another question here. What type of scientists and what type of academic environments we need? And I will quote here Freeman Dyson. I like his classification of scientists as other frogs who see only the flowers that grow nearby, and they study the details, but they go deep, but they remain in silos, and they ignore the context. Or birds who, as he put it, can also fly high in the air and survey broad vistas, and therefore have a global view of the challenges. And for the beneficial society, science we're talking about, I think we need more type of birds or bird type of approach to science. But current academic environments are still, and by and large, siloed monodisciplinary structures that favor frogs and favor quick short-term scientific gains instead of long-term thinking. You know, short assessment cycles, this publish or perish culture is predominant, and it puts extreme pressure. So we need a radical change in faculty appointment, promotion systems to encourage and consider interdisciplinarity and inclusiveness by young scientists especially. Something that we didn't mention is the role of industry in all this. Academic research, yes, is important, but at the early stages. And then innovation is mainly driven by business. And corporations have the resources and the capacity to take this further. And indeed, much of the investment in the applied sciences is spearheaded by the private sector. And it is them that will turn research outputs to tangible products that directly influence society. Most of the technologies developed at universities, they go into the valley of death and they disappear unless they are picked up by industry. So this is very, very, very important. It is very crucial that corporate and societal challenges interests are aligned as much as possible, especially in new technologies that are very disruptive, like AI that Anya mentioned a lot, and Industry 4 as well. And of course, big tech companies already run programs in these directions with, IBM Science for Social Good, and Google has this AI for good, etc. But we should never forget that markets are about profits and financial performance. They are not about responsibility, and they are not about being a good citizen. And so they never reward companies for doing a good thing. So ESG considerations and investments are not about responsibility. It's about profit. So we need metrics. We need new metrics to measure what has been kind of a corporate social responsibility. We need now technological social responsibility, which should include ethics. So we need specific metrics for that, and that's extremely difficult, of course. And we also need mechanisms to monetize these metrics. Otherwise, they will never be picked up by the industry. And maybe we can come back to this later. Finally, I would like to say a few things about the public engagement, the citizen engagement, which both the previous panelists mentioned. I think this is extremely important. And this raises the question, who defines what is good? We say, for social good, but who defines this? And of course, SDGs are a universally accepted set of principles, but their interpretation and implementation is not so obvious. Specific social context, for example, can activate certain social norms where innovations are considered more acceptable and desirable than in others. And again, I will use COVID here as an example. In China using surveillance and data analytics and AI, managed to fight the epidemic really fast, allowing normality to return sooner with huge economic and psychological benefits to the citizens. And this happened because the citizens were willing or happy to share the necessary data. But on the other hand, in other parts of the world, this was not possible, as this type of utilization of AI and technology is perceived as violation of human rights and democratic values. Which is fine, but this comes with a huge cost, not only in economic terms and social disruptions, but also in human lives. So So it's important it's important to make science to engage stakeholders at all levels, government, academic, the general public, to define what is good in specific context as well. And I think that's in that direction, education is crucial. Awareness of choice is not necessarily the choice, but awareness of choice, I think, is extremely important, so that the public are able to make informed decisions, to know the capabilities of AI systems and the consequences. I think also this inclusiveness and openness of science is a way to inspire trust and educate citizens as well, is a way to educate. I have some more thoughts about AI and ethics, but maybe I will stop now.
We have time, Georgios, to go back on these issues. So
yes.
Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your thoughts, very deep. I think you said technological corporate responsibility is one way to go about it. And the next speaker is Ketan Patel. You raised the importance of business, corporate societies, corporate businesses, and Ketan represents that industry in particular. And he has also been on the forefront of an initiative of the World Academy that deals with finance for social good. So Ketan, to you to tell us a bit more and to respond also to the points that Georgios raised.
You're muted, Ketan.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting panel. In terms of the picture as I see it, and so many interesting points to respond to and to link to. If I step back and say it this way, I think the pandemic has shown the critical role of science in a crisis, and that's become indisputable. Unfortunately, what we've also seen is that there are a range of stakeholders that might be averse to science or might be the opponents of the promulgation of science in society to solve problems. And it can't be too long ago, perhaps only 5 years ago, that we would have thought that almost everything that was a problem was in the reach of science to solve. And so the role of science in solving human issues, whether they were food, poverty, cleaning the environment, all these things were within the means if they could only be financed. And I think the pandemic has illustrated that you have science and scientists on one side and potentially politics and politicians on the other side. You also have science compromised perhaps by social media. And you have the value of truth perhaps undermined by the value of opinion in a society where there is so much noise in the information system itself. An overbearing amount of noise hitting people. And so science and perhaps its impact and its value seems to also vary by cultures. And we've seen that certain cultures are more vulnerable to the noise in the system than others. And those don't necessarily have to be the poorest cultures. They can sometimes be the most advanced from an information perspective. So whereas the pandemic has also shown the value of science, I think it's also exposed the vulnerabilities and also led us to understand now that we are interconnected. And if anyone is left out of the system of solving the problem, then actually we're all vulnerable. That doesn't seem to necessarily solve the problem though. So I think we have a much bigger, perhaps series of questions to ask. I think we begin probably by saying science is a social good for who? Is it for humans? Is it for other species? Is it for the planet and its ecosystem as a whole? If it is a humanistic view though, then we place human needs above all others. And of course, that is where we've come from, where the temptation is to define progress as science being funded to consume everything that we might want that are the desires of people rather than necessarily the needs. And so the consequences for the planet are severe as we consume just about everything. And I think that takes us to defining how does science fit within the framework. And as Donato, you said, we've been doing a very detailed study about the role of capital and capitalism and how does science fit in that seems actually a very interesting part of the model. So it seems as if capitalism is an all stakeholder model. And every individual has a role to play in that all stakeholder model. And so the politician has a role to play in meeting the needs of the elected people or otherwise. As we heard earlier, it could be in China's case, not necessarily elected in the traditional Western democratic sense, but still meeting the needs of people. The financier has a role to play, of course, in financing whatever needs to be done to meet those needs. Individuals, though, perhaps have the most important role. If they stop consuming the things that they think damage, then actually those things won't be financed ultimately. But how do you get to that, and how does science play the role? So it seems that two big questions arise for me in that. One is, if science allows us to keep consuming, then it needs to come up with alternatives to the materials that we consume so that we can consume without the consequences that damage the planet. And that's a huge task, to replace the basis of a whole carbon-based capitalist model with something cleaner and more suitable to a sustainable world. And I think that's a huge challenge. The second is, if science is not to do that, because it is not adequately funded to solve all these problems, to create a more sustainable world, then the challenge is for us to change our values so that we seek not to consume everything. And that seems like an even bigger task, potentially, because it requires each of us to change our behaviors. I think finance can help in that by financing the science or defunding. And the study that Donato referred to, which we also did for the UN and its SDG goals, what we found is finance is shifting its model to finance things that are more sustainable. But that's a long-term shift, and we may not have as long as we think. We need to do that. So one of the biggest tasks for science probably is to fund the bridge to 10 billion people. And if those 10 billion people behave the way the current just under 8 billion do, or the last 6.3 billion before we began this century, then we will consume everything. So there is an important social imperative, survival, maybe existential imperative for science and its role in the world. I'll stop there because I know we have a lot to discuss, I'm sure, and this will come back.
Thank you very much, Ketan. And from your words, I would keep on talking about human security, because what you just said, the importance of maintaining living standards, of keeping humanity alive, brings us also to the concept of human security and how science can support human security, how science and scientific advancements can do so. And so this would be a question for all our panelists. But first, I would give the floor to Gary Jacobs, the president of the World Academy, to introduce this sub-theme, with his own words. How do you, Gary, envisage the contribution of science to human security?
Well, thank you, Donato, and thanks to the panelists, because this has been already a fascinating discussion, which has raised so many complex issues. It called back to my mind that the issues for which the Academy was founded in the first place, because we had scientists who in that case were particularly involved with the development of the nuclear weapons, and then 15 years later realizing, how are we going to control these things? Something that Anya was spent some part of her career trying to still figure out 60 years after the Academy and 75 years after they were first used. And at the same time, we're facing with the pandemic, where one of our founding members was Jonas Salk, who developed the polio vaccine. And we even quoted him as when he asked, are you going to patent this? And he said, would you patent the sun? This is something for the human security of everybody. So we're really at very profound issues that we're addressing today. And Donato, the point you raised about human security is, the question is this going to be a compromise between many different types of interest? The interest of the scientist who's carried away in developing something that's interesting and fascinating, the interest of the commercial interests, the interests of government to use technology or control its proliferation, the interests of consumers, the impact on the environment and the general public. We are really faced with a dilemma here, which our speakers have beautifully brought out. How do we reconcile these contradictory, competitive, and to some extent, at least apparently, irreconcilable issues? And what would be the basis for that? I think that we had a wonderful discussion and presentation by Gerhard's colleague, Michael Mueller at Gesta, talking about how this institution is trying to reconcile, look at not only the scientific issues in a more interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary way, but look also at the interface between science and policy. And I just would mention here, before we go back to the very interesting second round, is that this is an issue that the Academy has been asking itself. About 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, we met with Ban Ki-moon just after he retired from being the Secretary General, because it was obvious, and it is obvious to most everybody now, that the SDGs are all wonderful in themselves, but essentially, depending on how we implement them and seek them, they can be mutually contradictory and competitive with one another as well. It's easy to accomplish one at the expense of others rather than reconciling them. And we don't have in our, as I think was already mentioned in the beginning, we don't have, even in our universities, even at the level of research or of the level of education, we don't really have effective ways for coordinating and reconciling the different perspectives of different disciplines. We don't have basically in our education, in the technology and the physical sciences, looking at the social impact. We recently had a meeting collaboration with IEEE. Georgios is talking about the computer technology. These were the artificial intelligence group. And we asked them, how much do your students get oriented on the impacts and implications of the implementation of artificial intelligence in various fields? And they said virtually nothing. You're teaching them the technology. So these issues that we're discussing, which are so interesting, kind of point to a certain basic schizophrenia, or at least a severe fragmentation in the way our society is grappling with issues. On the one hand, our disciplines are fragmentary, our education is divorced to a large extent from the realities of the society. There's a big gap between our education and our scientific research and policymaking, and how far our public policies are really designed or can be designed to handle this. And then we hand this over to the commercial organizations, and the financial considerations come in, and then there's the impact on society and the environment. So what type of organizational structures would really be capable of managing this? That's why I found the effort at Gesta so exciting, because at least they're asking the fundamental question. It means, doesn't it mean a whole reorganization of and if you want to put human security at the core of this, who's in charge of human security in the world today? Whose responsibility is that to determine what is human security, or how we're going to maximize it? And how do we reconcile all these issues? So I think that let the discussion go on, but it's very rich in raising the challenges that we're facing right here today.
Thank you, Gary. So I would continue with Gerhard. The question is the same. I mean, let's escape from the competitive security paradigm, but to a more comprehensive focus that, of course, includes scientific discovery, science in general, but also issues of environment, and education, health, and so forth. So what is your prognosis for the future of science in terms of helping human beings to upkeep human security and to affirm human security whenever possible.
Okay, if we solve this, I'm sure this seminar will go viral. I would say three things, maybe, or maybe more. I don't know. The first is human security. I think today has to be thought in wider thing. So there are always three questions science or others should ask is, what is the impact on the individual, on the human being, on the humanness of us? What is the impact on society, what you are asking in this case, what is the security? And what is the impact on the planet? Because you cannot, I think you should no longer, and you cannot actually separate these three questions. What is the breakthrough of a regulation, of a policy, or of a technology for these three levels? And it's very important to keep them always together. They're a little bit different, and of course, they are humanistic or or individualistic or ecological, but they just belong together, and you have to. So it's more complicated, and we have to teach. And I think we start in many universities and so forth. We start to teach that you have to have this inclusive health. Let's say, health is an inclusive idea that goes from your liver to the planet, and that would be my first point in that sense of security. Second, I think it's trivial. Science is both part of the problem and part of the solution. So we are part of the problem, and that's for me always. We are part of the problem if we do bad science. Not so if we have a bad application, that of course can happen. I mentioned the dual use. But bad science is, and if you take COVID, I didn't mention COVID that much because for scientists it's too early to tell. We should be able to do the analysis in 5 years. We will check what worked, what didn't, what happened. But for the moment, let's get on intuition. But so there's like 200,000 COVID-19 papers published since the beginning, and we can safely assume that 2/3 of that are meaningless. I mean, that's just publishing for publishing, and of course, there's a mechanism there and so forth. So, doing in a time of pandemic, of panic, and so forth, not good science is the first problem of science, I would say. And who mentioned Georgios? You mentioned that you want science to be big, and I think it makes sense. It makes sense. We have to go beyond what we cherished, the old white man like me that runs a lab and gets the Nobel Prize. I didn't get it, don't worry. But and to think big is to think actually it's more like impactful. Think impactful. And if you take the COVID research that worked, was the one that had a certain level of size. It was the recovery trials and so forth. So these trials that were big enough and international, some and linked by WHO, coordinated by WHO, or the UK was very good. They brought answers. But the 7,000 little clinical trials run by 7,000 old white men in 7,000 hospitals just didn't bring it. It's not possible. So that's my first thing. What we should bring is good science in that sense, not good in the moral sense, but just good with the procedures admitted by the scientific community for that particular field, and it can change from field to field. Of course, there's no single unique scientific method anymore. That was when physics ran the world. There was, but now it's messy, and that's fine too. So that will be my second point. I didn't mention, and the third point maybe is that we have to, our stress on anticipation, it's to help think the future in a resolvable, in a way that we find solutions. So, for instance, if you take climate, so of course, Ketan is right that we need a beneficial, virtuous circle between economy and technology and behavior of people or societies. So if we set up agreements where selfishness or pulling out is actually beneficial because the others will pay for you. It's a bad agreement. It doesn't work with human nature. You don't need much neuroscience to know that it will not work. So you have to find virtuous circles. I think for the energy transition, we are finding it. We are finding that solar and other energies will actually have the business cycle, the carbon tax probably in many regions, and the deployment that is necessary to do the ecological transition for these energies. But in good science, we know it's not enough. That will not bring us to zero carbon emissions, the zero CO2 emissions. So we have to tell governments, people, citizens, whatever, that we need more technologies that do not exist today to actually reduce carbon. If we want to avoid, to spray by geoengineering, to spray some dust into the atmosphere, which is a cheap but probably very dangerous thing. We can analyze it. We can make the experimental frame for that internationally. But the contribution of science to say, okay, of science alone is to do this. You will need more in 2050. You will need more than solar panels or whatever. Let's look at nuclear for science is a dossier. It's not it's not a passion. It should be. Maybe it's necessary in some regions. Maybe Switzerland can avoid it, or Germany. We actually decided not to anyone use it. That's what I mean by what science can bring to human security. There's a relative coldness, maybe, together, asking even the tough questions, saying all the things that you discuss now in COP and so forth will not be enough for 2050. Let's prepare. And I don't even touch the behavior because social engineering, I think, is too complex for me, and we shouldn't even consider it a solution probably. But at least working security. We vote. Swiss people vote in 2 weeks for security. Can we have a secure food system if we no longer use any pesticides? That's what people should vote. And we see that the science is actually not there. I mean, there has not been enough experimentation science to know if we can remove all pesticides or all chemicals from agriculture and still be self-sufficient. So that's what would be my sort of small points to this very interesting debate.
Thank you, Gerhard. Thank you, Professor Escher. And let's go to Anya. Anya, further reflections from you. You that also work for disarmament affairs, covered so many different issues in the United Nations system. What is your perspective around this particular subject, that is science and human security?
Thank you, Donato. There's been so many interesting issues raised. I feel like my neural transmitters has been firing now, wanting to touch all of them. I won't because it would take too much time, but I can see we can definitely continue this discussion for some time. Just to pick up on the last point that Gerhard was referring to around the social engineering, and I'm not going to go deep into it, but I was just listening to a podcast that speaks about this particular domain in science, which is called cognitive humanology. I'd never actually heard of it. And they speak about how do you inoculate our cognitive dimensions to tackle mis and disinformation. So the purposeful and the less purposeful, spreading of fake information, as also dealing with, just your own reality. And what they didn't touch upon in this podcast, I'm happy to share the link to it if anyone is interested, was, of course, what does cognitive immunology look like in an algorithmically enhanced reality? And how do you inoculate, when the messages are able to be scaled at the way that they're able to be scaled? So these are some big issues, but it was a field of science that I've never heard of. And it was just very interesting to me. And I thought I'd just mention it, given the point that was made on social engineering, which I think is very important. It's also important because we speak a lot about how technology and algorithmic technologies in particular will impact on democracy. But what underpins democracy is society. And what we are seeing is that technology and algorithmic technologies in particular are indeed impacting deeply on societies. It's altering societies, it's altering values and principles. And how we're not sufficiently discussing if we are accepting that it's altering societies, and the values of societies, how is it then changing our democratic methodologies for tackling those societal changes? We have certain democratic ideals, but are they fully reflecting what a changing society as a result of change in behavior, social engineering, accessibility? I saw that was mentioned in one of the comments in Q&As. Is that accessibility meaningful? Do you have the right knowledge? Are we having trustworthy decision makers? Is the science investment, as Patel was referring to, has there been enough thinking going into the R&D budgets, be that in industry or in government or in any other field, and who makes a decision, who owns our data? So these are some of the big issues. Let me go back to one comment I wanted to make, and this is very much triggered by what Gary was saying, and also about the foundation of the academy. Now, a very important part of that foundation, as much as, and also the debate that was going on following the whole nuclear era, this was the establishment of what was called the Pugwash community. And although the Pugwash community, which was really a lot of the same scientific minds that came together and established the academy, they also came together and saying, we as scientists need to have a discussion on the bigger policy implications of this technology that we have now created, and all future technologies that might have equally lethal impact. And the Pugwash Society is still active today, maybe not as active as some of us would have liked to see it, but it's still active. And I think there's a huge potential in thinking, what does the Pugwash community of today look like? How do we make sure, and this, be that within the academy framework and any other framework, we need a Pugwash for 2021 and beyond. Who should be involved in this type of discussions? It doesn't have to be within the formal bounds, but it has to be a platform where everyone feels comfortable to having these difficult discussions. And one of the in the sort of, if you're looking then in the more sort of arms control and the the aspects of warfare, there's an interesting, because you mentioned dual use yourself, Donato, in your beginning remarks, looking at the dual uses of technology, and it was mentioned by a couple of others. The big challenge today of modern type of technologies and the convergence of technologies is that not only are we shifting in some ways, not shifting, but adding a component of coercion control, not just arms control. Because as I was alluding to with the social engineering, there's a risk, that we are indeed looking at technologies that change the values and principles of whole societies. So it's not just the character of warfare changing as a result of new technologies. We're talking more about the actual components that used to be in a war, but that the nature of warfare is changing. And I've certainly been one of those who's been working in this field for some time, who's been long arguing, saying, no, the nature of warfare is not, the nature of war is not changing. It's just the character of war, because we're talking about what we're using to fight wars with. But I think especially in the recent, say 2 to 3 years, that is changing. And I think it is changing faster also because of the digital acceleration, or the acceleration of our adoption of technology in our life, as Ketan was referring to, has not least been accelerated in the margins of this pandemic, because we've been forced into a new digital reality. And how we set up society to deal with that change in how we think about, dominating a narrative in a country, as opposed to thinking about this as standalone technologies used for purposes that we more link to classical ways of doing warfare. Another thing that is changing, also to Gary's point, is of course our thinking around deterrence. And he mentioned, that the academy was very much established out of the reality of the Second World War. And I think we still make the mistake that we think that these new technologies can be fitted into our old ways, our old narratives around deterrence theory. The problem is, of course, if you speak about AI, if you speak about, this enhancement type of feature technologies, if you speak about cyber vulnerabilities, the deterrence theory doesn't apply the same way. So you're not comparing asset to asset. You're not saying I have this and I will use it, because you don't know what the other one has. So a lot of what we're dealing with now is perceptions of capabilities as opposed to a show of capabilities. And that is changing relations in ways that we haven't quite yet started really discussing the depth and the impact of. Then just a point on, I thought was very interesting, that was Georgia was mentioning this issue around technological social responsibility. And I know I was just reading that the G20 is meeting this coming week, and that they have 5 key themes for their meeting. And one of them, and they called it the 5 realignments. And I thought it was very interesting because one of them is technological realignment. And they describe that such a realignment must take place, and it demands mechanisms, regulation, and principles to ensure that technological innovations contribute to human well-being and societal progress. So there is a recognition at the highest level in policymaking that there is a need for a realignment. I have no other insights on what is online, but I thought would just be a very interesting thing to flag for those listening, something maybe to follow and look more into, because it'll be interesting to see what will come out of these higher policy discussions. And then I thought it was very interesting what Ketan was mentioning around new type of vulnerabilities. We are all vulnerable, right, in this new context. And I think that's a very important point, because as we are internalizing our shared vulnerability, we also need to question if our way of thinking around resilience also then needs to change. Because if we have a new type of vulnerabilities, do we have the right type of resilience thinking to help us with those vulnerabilities? Some of them that are less tangible than we are used to and requires us to dive into universes and not least bring stakeholders together in different ways than what we used to. And that brings me to the point that Georgia was making when he spoke about silos, and I agree with him. This is a big challenge. The incentives are not there. That's a big issue in terms of university level, engagements. We see still, that there's very little focus on making sure that ethics, for example, is not just a elective course, but is part of any type of technological training, just as technological, some parts of engineering should come into any type of policy degree. I think you should also make sure that ethics and policy is consistently being integrated into technological degrees of any sort. And he was referring to Freedom Dyson's frogs. So I thought I used the word, that from the bee world, that we need to cross-pollinate much more. So it's not just because I find that sometimes we focus on the cross-sectoral sort of stakeholder approach, where you make sure that you have different people from different domains in a room. But what is often not being focused on is that that's great. You have different domains mixed up, but how do you actually make sure that bringing together is also leading to cross-pollination, so that you have an impact from it, in the way that we conduct, our disciplines and our work. And then a very last point around the SDGs, and again a reference, so I was reading this book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Kimmerer, great book for anyone who's interested. And she speaks really well about this concept of reciprocity. So my first degree was in anthropology, so this is a word that appears a lot in anthropological research. But I thought that was a nice word to actually bring into a discussion where we talk about science for good, and science doing good and science for good, is this issue of reciprocity. And what Kimmerer argues is that our approach to SDGs, or approach to sustainability in general, is how we do the same slightly differently, but it's not how we don't do it, how we shouldn't be doing it at all. So she's saying that as opposed to actually adopting more of a, sort of a older, more kind of tribal society's view of reciprocity, where you have a mutual respect to nature, we are often focused on how we are going to exploit and consume no matter what, but we might be able to do it just slightly better, but we're still going to do it. And so she says, maybe it's time to bring in a new thinking around what reciprocity looks like in a technological age, which links then to what Ketan was also speaking about, if we have shared vulnerabilities, we need to rethink resilience, and maybe it's time to really bring in the concept of reciprocity in our way of thinking about science for good. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Anya. You opened so many vast areas for further discussion, and we abstain from comment right now. But I just want to read out a couple of comments we received from participants. We have several participants online, and I invite them to come in with their questions, eventually to join the panel if they wish so. I have a comment by Anne Snick that I think is interesting to read. As long as science does not reflect critically on the anomalies it produced and change its paradigm, society will rightly distrust science. This is one point of view. There is another one from Zach McKinney, who writes, how can the essential scientific values of curiosity, intellectual humility, and appreciation of uncertainty and complexity be promoted as social values to ever broader cultures and communities, especially those who are skeptical or resistant to scientific language and thinking? So these are some of the comments we do receive. Someone says, how about UN platform, how UN could help us coordinating all the thoughts that are coming out of these discussions on science and social issues. I mean, this is what we, in our humble self, are trying to do through these dialogues of and this one in particular on science as social good. Let's continue with Georgios and Ketan. Our next short comment, please, because we want to keep on. We still have half an hour, a bit less. Georgios?
Thank you, Donato. I think I took too much time in my first statement, so I will be very short now. I have kept a number of notes. I want to raise three points, to follow up on 3 points. One is by the point raised by Gerard on the bad science, and I think that's spot on. That's absolutely true, and that's what I was trying to say earlier. That the way our academic environments are set up, they are set up to produce bad science. We produce PhDs, like a machine, and nobody really cares what they are about, and it's all about publications and numbers, but not about essence. And it's short term, short cycles. I remember when I was in the UK, I spent most of my academic career in the UK. You are assessed every 4 years, and every 4 years you have to submit your papers, and these papers should not be related to papers that you did 4 years ago in the previous cycle. So this is like, there's no long-term like vision, And I was thinking that perhaps this is the problem that we face with COVID, because we are producing this bad science. When humanity faced such a serious challenge, we were not ready. We didn't have the mechanism. We were not ready actually to fight it, and that's why we've been going in cycles maybe for 2 years now. It is because the science we have produced is really bad. That reflects on education. That's a point that Gary mentioned. I think this is critical. Because of this research environment, the teaching environment is reflected in this. Students are not really exposed to challenges and problems and societal. They are just follow the strict curricula, and it's very important because we want to deliver graduates that will be informed citizens, right, with a holistic mindset. But also because they will be the future scientists, and they will be the future investors and entrepreneurs. So we need to make sure that they have this kind of
I think it's frozen for a second. Maybe Ketan, you can pick up from here, and Georgios will continue afterward. Ketan?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Wow, what a rich, interesting conversation. Dr. Escher and Anya, you touched on so many interesting points. I would offer the following, just trying to be succinct. From a human security perspective, and I think, Donato, you kind of kicked that part of the conversation off. I think, Dr. Escher, you said it just as I would have believed it, which is that they're inseparable. The human security and the planetary security question, those two are completely inseparable. And it's only our beliefs that are the problem, because we've been led to believe, probably because of a consumer model that became the base of our financial system and our economic system, that the two were separated. But in terms of the role of scientists in human security and in just the role of scientists, I think, per se in civilization, we've seen science deliver the energies like oil that we now say, are horrible and destroy the world, but also the resources like coal and how to exploit them and mine them, and the minerals like plastics, which pollute the oceans now, and we can see the consequences, but also the weapons like the nuclear ones, and information technology and media like social media that we see changes the value of truth. So the sciences delivered everything actually the civilization thought it needed to take us to the heights of human achievement that we experience today. But there are consequences, and there's a point at which the science needs to rethink how we live in the world and how we avoid the disaster that come from the great achievements that we've seen mankind reach to. So the problems are certainly the belief sets, because we get fixed thinking we need more of the same. And I think this is where we become less resilient, because we think what worked for us will continue to work for us and continue to deliver, and it will make us happy. And that's an odd word to use, I know, but I would guess now that science and art have always been in the service of politicians. And Gary, I think, as we've talked about this in terms of the Academy's role, science and art have been in the service of politicians, conquerors, and the money. And probably Leonardo da Vinci, encapsulated that beautifully in developing military inventions, as well as beautiful art that was enlightening for people. And I think from a human security perspective, if we define freedom as choice and we don't change the values, then we end up in a place where science will have to keep providing the things that give people the chance to consume everything that they wish to consume to make themselves happy. And so I would guess we're at the brink of two enlightenments this time round. One is the next scientific enlightenment, which breaks the new boundaries to create something more sustainable, which will become unsustainable at some point too in the future, and probably faster than the Industrial Revolution got us to this point. And the second enlightenment is probably an enlightenment of beliefs, perhaps of consciousness or awareness, and therefore that affects our fundamental beliefs about what it takes to be happy, and what it takes to have a meaningful existence. So I think we're at that kind of interesting point in our existence. And I think there's cause for optimism. Science has demonstrated throughout all of our history that it can solve the biggest issues of the time. And ultimately those issues get financed. And ultimately the politicians make sure that those are the issues of the day that will be the most important. And in a world where information links us all, I think the people will also demand the solutions, and the politicians will follow rather than lead on that too, I hope. And so as a for-profit institution, and we have a not-for-profit side to us, we see that financiers like ourselves wish to finance the change, the transition to something more sustainable. And there's cause to be optimistic about that.
Thank you very much, Ketan, for your thoughts and suggestions and reflection on the role of the World Academy. I think we lost Georgios. I don't know if he's still with us. I hope he can catch up with the last round probably that we're going to have. And I would like to pick up from one of the remarks by Anya, the need to reshape or rethink about resilience, what resilience means in view of the scientific changes, discoveries, and also the role of science in anticipating change and accelerating also the response to the various challenges that you all eminent speakers and scientists today have mentioned. So what is really the role of science in terms of anticipating change, and what is the message that you could pass on to young people, to the youth in general? As World Academy, we have a large segment of our membership is made of young persons who are entering their careers, actually the early days of their careers in science, in arts, in businesses in general. So what is the message that you could give them for their early start in a transformational society? I would start again from Gerard, and then Anya, and then you that you just spoke, Ketan. So Gerard, please.
Yeah, I would, maybe the first advice would be don't listen to old frogs, but I step just one back and then, but still answering your question. And I think what science has to better do is the choice of priorities, because that's the jobs of the young people. And I think if we take the mRNA technology that revolutionized vaccine production in this pandemic, I mean, before they were billionaires, they actually were underfunded little labs. So we need a mix. There's a truth that actually scientists are good judges, or are maybe the only ones we have, not good ones for other scientists. So we need a process where a part of the scientific enterprise is really judged by fellow scientists. Of course, government or society can put boundaries to that. How many young people versus old people are funded? How many, communities? So, I mean, you can put a lot of boundaries. But if you enter into the content of what should be really researched, I think we are a little bit in trouble, because that's the example. It was the same thing actually with HIV 20 years ago. It was a lab that had even no funding somewhere in Pasteur Institute that found the virus, but they had 20 years of training in looking at those strange things. And so we have to keep this diversity, this biodiversity, and it's best done if there is some self-regulation at this level, at the level of research projects, of course. And so that would be the engine that is still necessary to work. Of course, then government can launch big projects, Horizon. I mean, can make missions, mission-oriented research, and all that thing is in addition to this fundamental process that has to be a little bit messy and a little bit, all directional. Advocate science, to enter into a scientific career, to do good. I still think that the first ethics is to be a good scientist. That's just, you have to. If you don't know your math or your history or whatever is necessary in your field, then all the other ethics are a little bit biased by that. So we should also see that when I started my career 40 years ago, interdisciplinarity was a thing to achieve. It was really everywhere, a lot of congresses, UNESCO, everything. And we don't have it. So we actually have interdisciplinarity because of the convergence of techniques, because of the convergence of the technological development. So it will come outside from objects, it will come into the. And young people, I think, are very good. They have this mentality to try out stuff and move very quickly into startup world. Startup mind. And of course, the startups are now completely. There are many non-profit startups. There are many, it's no longer just waiting to be bought by a bigger company. And I think there I have a lot of, and that's also a little bit of citizen science actually. So as soon as you have found the passion, maybe move a little bit out, or keep one foot into the academic world, move a little bit out and do it. It's the time to do stuff. I'm not sure if science is, science is really an engine that produces ideas, that produces objects, that produces facts, whatever. And we cannot slow down that. We take also a major risk. So of course, a more resilient and more sustainable society is necessary. But still, we should make sure that science is still, free enough to actually propose a lot of alternatives. So you can choose something, that you can choose something from that and make these choices. And of course, we have to teach us and everybody actually how to analyze these kind of how to evaluate these kind of choices. But science should be a choice proposal. I mean, it should make things possible, and then you pick things. But science should not be the way to say what you should do and you should not do. I'm done actually. No, I'm not done. I finished my sentence. I enjoy this panel.
It's just a technical problem. Now we are on. I think we also, Georgios is back with us. Anya is next. What is your message, Anya, for the next generation of scientists?
So thank you so much. And I think it's a fantastic question to end this conversation with as well. I was thinking about something that Ketan was saying in his remarks about how the way we are interacting on these new digital platforms is changing the value of truth. And I think to me, science is a enabling tool to have a different type of correspondence with reality, right? It's sort of a way of assessing truth. And that's something to take with us. I will probably end with saying, I mentioned a podcast already. I refer to a book. I will continue to refer to something that might help us all internalizing what science and scientists mean in our day-to-day life. Because I think a lot of times, and I see this a lot in my work, there is still a bit of othering going on between scientists and other domains and scientists. And to break down those barriers and break down the fear around science, how we integrate it into our day-to-day life. One of my heroines and scientific heroine is actually someone who was able to write about scientific discoveries in terms of poetry, Rachel Carson. Now, Rachel Carson became one of the most impactful scientists of her time, basically through her work, ensuring that there was a ban against the use of certain chemical fertilizers with deeply harmful impacts on humans. We have seen other scientists, the whole origin of the Biological Weapons Convention was one fought by scientists, linking up and engaging with policymakers to, again, illustrate and demonstrate the harmful impact on humans, by bringing real-time, examples, to the policy table. There's a lot of really important work done by scientists that we often forget, and we forget who they were as people. Who was Rachel Carson? What triggered her? What kind of fueled her, her passion to do this, and taking also the criticism? Because of course, as we go back to the truth can be very inconvenient, and science can sometimes shed light on very inconvenient truths. So operating in that space where things get inconvenient as a young scientist, a young engineer, is very, very important. And so I would definitely recommend as a reading, for those listening, Maria Popova, who's initially a blogger. She has a great blog called Brain Pickings. And she also wrote a book called Figuring. Now, the book Figuring is a very, very thick book, so don't get discouraged. But the book is essentially about some of the core scientists of our time and who they were as people and what drove them in that mission to correspond with reality through science and through you looking at science in many different ways. But I think that ability to operate, with different opinions, making sure that we bring stakeholders that may not agree with us. Ketan was speaking about the importance of industry. It's interesting to note, back to Gary's point, that where did we lose scientists around the policy table? Well, interestingly, when you speak to people that were part of the establishment of the academy, the establishment of POGWASH, many of the other initiatives that have, was set up to bring these different stakeholder groups together, it happened maybe coincidentally, maybe not, when the sort of military-industrial complex involvement got less and less and more responsibility was moved into the corporate sector. Now, I have no empirical evidence to underpin this, but it's something that I hear the feedback from a lot of people that's been involved, since the 60s, since the 70s, some of them even earlier, work with people that was involved earlier. And so it's an interesting reflection that how do we bring them back? what is the connective tissue as we have a new stakeholder around the table, which is dominated by corporate interests, but not necessarily interested is immune to ethics, but they also are driven through other interests. So I'm one to really believe, ask questions, learn to be uncomfortable, deeply, deeply uncomfortable, learn that truth is multifolded, sometimes, because you're going to have different perspectives around the table. And being driven by the bottom line, or being driven by some ideological, sort of, which may feel more noble cause, may not be at odds, but you may need to think differently about how you bring those perspectives together somehow. So I do really, really firmly believe in cross-pollination, but that it is a deeply uncomfortable place to be sometimes. And we have to make sure that our young policymakers, scientists and everyone in between, away with the othering, come together and learn to be uncomfortable and ask questions.
Thank you for being so comfortable in uncomfortable situations. And also for the cross-pollination theoretical approach of yours. That is also the one of the World Academy, as you know. Gary, who is with us, could tell us that this is actually the mantra of the World Academy: cross-pollination and interdisciplinarity in general. Also, what you said in terms of learning from the past is so important. And the World Academy put in place a project of its own that is called World Academy at 60, that really digged into the findings and the personalities, the individuals that founded the academy, such as Einstein, Oppenheimer, Russell, and so forth. You mentioned Pugwash. As you know, we are contemporary to Pugwash in that sense. But now we have really little time left. I would like to hear just few words from Georgios, that is back with us, and Ketan. Really very, very short, please, because then we would like to give the floor to Gary for concluding remarks.
Thank you, Jonathan. I apologize. I think there was some kind of network problem. So we are moving, I think, towards a paradigm shift also in science. We are talking about science for social good. That implies trust, and the cornerstone of trust is explainability, and scientific knowledge so far is explainable, and this is why society can actually trust, because it is model based, but now we are getting into an era where humanity is placing its future into the hands of technologies that are not model based, that are data driven. And these are black boxes, this algorithmically enhanced reality that Anya very eloquently said before. So these are black boxes. They don't provide any explanation. They cannot provide any guarantee for their properties. And we depend on them. And this is the new science, okay? We cannot have standards. We cannot have standards to apply to machine learning and things like that. And therefore, we cannot have organizations that can elaborate what is safe, what is secure, what is right, what is wrong. We cannot have that. So I think it's very important that the public, the citizens, is informed of the different choices, and we need to be able to balance between the precautionary principle, be very conscious of the implications, and also the benefit. So for me, education is at the core of all citizens' education and awareness.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Georgios. And now, Ketan, a word from you, please. Unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I would say for the new scientists, perhaps, and for the existing ones too, one of the biggest challenges is people still believe in many parts of the world and have believed for a while that this is still the flu. And why did we do so much to damage ourselves in the face of the flu? The flu might kill 500,000 people in the same period, and this might have killed 3.5 million people, and it's still the flu. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges, to communicate the severity of what we face. And the economic and political resilience that I think, as Anya usually talk about resilience, there is a resistance for us as individuals in terms of our beliefs. There is an economic and political resilience that we have to measure too. And it seems like we put over 100 million people back into extreme poverty in this period. And so we are not quite as resilient as we think. We probably celebrate victory too soon, too often, and succumb to, therefore, successive waves. And so from a resilience perspective also, this coronavirus might not be the most dangerous pathogen that we faced. And from a competition perspective with it, with 3.5 million people dead, I assume that billions of the coronavirus pathogen have been killed too. And so, but it was not immobilized. It adapted faster. It learned perhaps quicker. It didn't have a populist leader or set of leaders telling it that it was all fine, that it already won. And so I think as we think about more dangerous pathogens and more dangerous crises that aren't just viruses of this type, but are dangerous because they're environmental disasters or they're poverty-driven disasters or systemic issues of another type, we will have to build a far more resilient society and that reestablishes the truth and funds the transition of our society. But the reestablishment of the truth, I think, is perhaps the most important charge of the new range of scientists that might come up and the elder statesmen scientists that are here to teach them.
Thank you very much to all of you. And now, Gary, to you the uneasy task to wrap it up after such a high-level debate with the impressive lineup of speakers and really very thorough and innovative kind of discussion for in general standards. So up to you for Gary to wrap it up.
Well, I think actually instead of being very difficult, it should be very easy because there have been so much profound contributions that we don't need to add anything to what's been said. And certainly it's impossible to summarize it. But I would like to just focus on one issue that is, in a sense, a summary or focuses on some of the links between it. Georgios, I think, is the one who talked about a need for a paradigm change. And I think the problems we're facing with the pandemic are really a good concrete example of some of the issues we've been talking about now. Because the issue is not which are the scientists we're talking about who are going to help us on the pandemic. It's not just those who are working on new vaccines or on treatment or on health treatment of patients. It's the economic science, it's the political science of global governance, it's the lawyers who are going to help us at the legal implications of this. It's the demographers who are looking at the social impact of this. This is affecting virtually every area of our life. And yet we've still got institutions, in spite of our efforts in the 50s and 60s for interdisciplinarity, we've still got institutions which are so fragmented. Even in our call for interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity, it's usually confined to a pretty narrow range. It'll be all the technology sciences are looking at each other, all the physical or natural sciences are looking, but it's not really covering all the disciplines that are involved. The Lancet Commission has Lancet has a commission on COVID-19. We have a number of our fellows who are involved in it, and it involves the legal, the human rights, the economic, the science, the health part of it, the employment part of it, and so forth. And this is the reality. And I think when we're looking for the future in an organization like ours, we need to be thinking about how are our organizations going to evolve? How is our institutional structure going to evolve? How are our universities going to evolve, not just to get the disciplines together, but to get much closer contact with the society? There was a reference to getting in touch with the youth and passing on our knowledge, how much knowledge we need to gain from our youth about what's really going on in the world today in order to change our thinking about the future and the strategies that will work. we really need something that's much more multi-stakeholder, as Gesta had in mind, but I think even broader than that, broader than just looking at the disciplines, bringing in the policymakers. You know, now we start with education, we start with research, and then we invent something, and then we go to policy, and then we go to implementation, and we pass it on to commercial institutions, and then we have an impact on the public. Could we imagine an institutional framework in which all these stakeholders are there from the beginning? I think if you look at the most successful corporations, I won't tell any stories now, but I'm thinking of one which is one of the premier pharmaceutical companies. They learned 50 years ago that if you're really going to be doing fundamental research on advances in medical science, you really need to be talking also to the patients, to those who are out in the field, to those who are living with these things today. We can't afford this isolation and this distance. Now, this is a big topic, and it would require fundamental restructuring of the way our society is organized. It sounds quite utopian, but is there a way? I think that's why we were so inspired by Gesta's efforts, because there's a recognition we need a new model, we need new reorganization, and I don't see how we're going to solve the problems we have today without those structural changes, without a lot of experimentation. The Academy itself is looking at such models, and we would welcome collaboration, we'd welcome ideas from those who are doing, trying, testing, or imagining other ways in which we could be organizing our social interactions. And hopefully, as this meeting illustrates, our new technology, our communication technology, makes feasible what was not feasible before in terms of bringing in all of the stakeholders from the beginning, rather than going in this sequential line that we have been doing up until now. So I'd like, on behalf of the Academy, to thank all of the participants, the speaker panelists in this, for a really fascinating discussion, which certainly exceeded my expectations of how much could be raised and explored in such a short period of time. In the Academy, we're very interested to continue with this work, to explore the implications, to study the implications of the points of view that have been presented here very briefly, and to see how we can build on this and build a future program of work which more seriously addresses the issues you've touched today. So thank you very much for sharing your views with us. And my thanks to all the participants. I regret we didn't have more time to hear questions and comments from, we have a very distinguished group of those who have been listening to us. But we would like to invite those comments to us. And as we will be continuing work on this, we will like to take into account as much as we can the views of those who haven't had a chance to share them today. So
thank you, Gary. Thanks. And in closing, in fact, I want to just mention that we had more than 40 attendees to today's conference, today's discussion. Among them, we have questions from Witold Kistner, from Alberto Zucconi, Marcel van der Voort, Marajan Matou, all saying that this discussion was bringing some interesting aspects that they wanted to flesh out as well. And as a closing, I can read what Witold Kistner is saying: the exponential pace of scientific, engineering, and technological developments has made it impractical for a person to learn what is known using the current educational system. In the past, acquired knowledge and skills lasted her lifetime and were sufficient for one job. Today, knowledge doubling happens in months, days, and even hours. So obviously we have new chances and new possibilities for the education of in different ways. So education is a point on our agenda, as we all know. Thank you for attending this discussion. Really was a great pleasure for all of us from the World Academy. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Good.
Safe journeys.
You too. Thank you.